Okay, okay. So, hi Neil. Um, uh, I am so happy to have you on this podcast. My name
Thank
is
you.
Preet. Oh yeah, my name is Preet, and I've always just loved the humanities and the liberal arts and wanted to study it, and I'm pursuing that now as an adult. So. I'm kind of hoping to speak to experts like you and get your perspective on certain classical texts. So we can just start by having you introduce yourself.
Hi, yeah, my name is Neil Van Leeuwen. I'm currently Associate Professor of Philosophy at Georgia State University, and I work mainly in philosophy of mind, but I also cross over into psychology and cognitive science. And I've done a fair bit of work in cognitive science of religion. So I have a book out recently, if I can just plug it for a minute. It's called Religion as Make-Believe. It might be backwards in
No,
your
it looks
screen.
great. Yeah,
It looks good.
yeah.
Okay, good. And so I've worked on basically the question of what is religious belief. And one of the texts that I found inspirational all the time was Hume's Dialogues on Natural Religion. How do people think and reason, and more generally, what are their psychological attitudes toward um, uh, the idea that a deity exists? So that's really what I guess brings us into contact.
Yeah, and I love that. I read a paper of yours, I think that precedes the book that talks about our religious attitudes. Our cognitive attitudes towards our religious beliefs versus factual beliefs, which I think your book expands on. Um, and I think also, the book that we want to discuss today, which is David Hume's, like, um, what is that? Dialogues concerning David Hume's dialogues concerning natural religion. Those, I feel like those kind of overlap in so many ways because I think ultimately what Hume goes through, and I think we'll talk a little bit about the book, but ultimately what Hume gets at the end of the book is that religion is psychologically, you know, harmful to human beings. That's his position. I mean, and I don't think you explicitly say that in your book, but the fact that we have different attitudes towards religious beliefs versus factual beliefs kind of hints at that it's not reasonable. It's not something that is grounded in any evidence.
Yeah, so I think Hume does a few important things that I think are relevant. And we'll start by distinguishing psychological causes from actual reasons for endorsing a certain idea, like that God exists. So toward the end of the book, so just to frame things a little bit, there are three characters in Hume's dialogues concerning natural religion. There's Cleanthes, that's someone you might think of as kind of a religious fundamentalist, right? And then you have Demia, who is someone who's more something like a deist, something like, okay, I believe in an abstract God concept, but I'm not really lining up behind all the biblical stories necessarily. I can think of them as allegories or something like that. And then there's Philo, who is something like a natural philosopher, and people tend to think Philo is the one who speaks for Hume. Okay. And toward the end, the problem of evil comes up. That's a very familiar problem in philosophy with the idea of God's existence. And the way we can think about it is there's a lot of bad stuff in the world. If God is all powerful and God is all benevolent, why is this bad stuff allowed to happen? And people can take that as an argument against the existence of God. Well, it's like, look, the bad stuff is here. The idea that a good God exists predicts that there shouldn't be bad stuff. Ergo, probably not a God in existence. Um, but what Philo points out in that later dialogue, I think it's dialogue 11, is basically that hardship psychologically makes people tend to become more religious, right? Become more connected to the idea that there's this benevolent God. But rationally speaking, evidentially speaking, it should do the exact opposite. It should
Mhm.
lead people to say, huh, all this bad stuff is happening. Maybe this deity figure doesn't exist. So that's one of the puzzles that is really important. And so it does connect up with my work because, my work deals with what is the nature of the psychological relation that people have to their religious stories and doctrines. And my point is, well, it's not the same thing as evidence-based factual belief. It's more like an imaginative allegiance that defines someone's group identity and really activates their sacred values, right? Which is a different way of relating to ideas from ordinary factual belief.
Yeah, and I think in your book you also mentioned that factual beliefs give um kind of they help you um they're open to kind of evidence from the external world, right? So like if I think there are tomatoes in the refrigerator and I go look and there aren't any tomatoes in the refrigerator, that belief I'm willing to put it away. Like I'm not attached to it with the same fervor as I am with a religious belief, it seems. Whereas, if I really like if I have cancer and I really pray to God and my cancer doesn't go away, I still don't really give up the idea of God. It's, maybe God has a plan, or maybe I'm not really taking feedback from what's happened, which is the core distinction between factual belief and something that's a religious belief.
Yeah, that's one of the main differences, at
Yeah.
least. So just to
Yeah.
go back to your tomato example, say you think there are tomatoes in the fridge, right? And then you go to the fridge and you look and you see that it's empty. It's not just that you're willing to give up the belief, your factual belief, oh, there were tomatoes in the fridge, but rather you can't help it,
Yeah.
right? So the vulnerability to evidence of our ordinary factual beliefs about the world, many of which are just knowledge, right? So if a factual belief is true and based on evidence, then we can say, well, that's something that you know. But factual belief is the matter-of-fact way of relating to ideas that people commonly just take for granted. And yeah, so it is quite different to have what I call religious credence. So going back to Hume's dialogues, we look at Cleanthes. Um, he's not going to give up the idea that God exists, come what may. And throughout the dialogues, he even becomes kind of aware of and sympathetic to the weakness of the arguments in favor of the existence of God. He's following along with Philo's position quite well, and by the end, he kind of admits it. And maybe let's just pause for a second to talk about what the overall arc of the dialogues actually is.
Yeah.
So there's this famous argument from design for the existence of God. It goes back to William Paley, and it goes something like this. Look, if you found a watch on the beach, you would assume that the watch had a designer, an intelligent agent who made the watch. So if you see a complicated world with all the parts interacting and so on and so forth, by analogy, you should conclude that this world has an intelligent designer, a deity, so to speak. And what Philo is doing over the arc of the dialogues is he's coming at that argument from many different angles and just pointing out how weak it is, right? How there are important points of disanalogy, and there are plenty of reasons to question why we would think that's a good analogy and so on. So without getting too far into the weeds, he's basically, for most of the dialogues, he's winning, and then he caps it off with the argument for evil right before the end, right? And one of the resolutions of the problem of evil, by the way, is to say, well, there is an all-powerful God, but God's not that nice. Or you could say, well, God's benevolent, but not entirely powerful.
Mm.
Okay. And this conversation, it sort of aggravates Demea so much that Demea leaves. So
Mm,
he's the less fundamentalist one. But it seems like this line of talk where maybe God's not all powerful is irreverent. So in the last dialogue, it's just Philo and sorry, Cleanthes talking. And they kind of come to a point of consensus where Philo says, look, the world is such a complicated and interesting place. There's got to be some level of analogy to human-like intelligence in whatever put it together. But that's kind of all we can say. And then it becomes this terminological question, whether we want to call that thing God, like whatever it is that is responsible for the intricate structure of the laws of physics and the intricate nature of the world, where things are in many ways exquisitely balanced. I mean, it's probably in many ways way different from us, but in some ways, just in terms of having a logic to it, it's like us. So what the ending friction comes to be between Philo and Cleanthes is just that, well, should we call this thing God?
mm,
And that's where they really come apart. So Cleanthes says, yeah, we should call it God because it's good for people's morality. It's good to subscribe to this notion of God. And Philo is really, really much less confident that it would have any kind of good moral or political consequences, right? So the dialogues are great because they leave you in kind of an unresolved
yeah,
place. It leaves you saying, yeah, there's not really any good reason to think that there's an agent like God, analogous to a person like you see portrayed in the Old Testament,
right,
or the New Testament for that matter. There's not, the argument for analogy can't be used to establish an agential God like that. Furthermore, there's the problem of evil, which creates more problems. But there's, the first cause, if you want to use Aristotelian terms, has some structure to it. Should we give our allegiance to this way of calling that thing, whatever it is, a God? And it comes apart. It ends up being sort of a empirical conjecture almost that doing so is better for morality, and versus not doing so is maybe more beneficial to humanity, right? So that's where the dialogues end up, and I think it's a great piece. I'm glad we're talking about it, so your audience can maybe go out and get a copy. It's a thin book, so you can probably get through it in a handful of sittings.
yeah. I mean, what I think I took away from the book is I think what the main point that Hume is making, which not the main, I mean, he makes a lot of points, but he's saying we can't know, and I really like that stance of, okay, maybe, it kind of is like a watch. The world is kind of like a watch, but then there are these things that don't add up. It's not exactly like a watch. It's not exactly like a machine. And so we're always making assumptions um, about who designed the world, who designed the watch, and we assume that this person is, like you said, powerful or kind or good or infinite. And he's not saying that it's not the case, that it might not be the case, but he's just saying that we can't know. And and looking at the world through religion or even through science, these are two ideas, these are two options. But there's astrology, or there could be something completely different that we haven't thought about. And so I like the mode of inquiry that he's in, which is really different from the mode of absolute belief. And I think Philo is in that philosophical, skeptical mode, and Cleanthes is also kind of willing to question, as opposed to, I think, Demia, who's very much, this is these are the things that I feel like he's more on the side of belief. So yeah, I don't know if you have anything to say to that.
Well, I think, kind of returning to this topic, I think Cleanthes interestingly illustrates what I think of as the difference between religious credence and factual belief. So Cleanthes is unwilling to give up on the idea that God exists, um, come what may, so to speak. At the same time, he clings to it, right? This is the level of religious credence, all the while understanding all of Philo's reasons for being skeptical and so on and so forth. So the attitude of Cleanthes is what I would call not vulnerable to evidence, right? I mean, if you were just going on the basis of evidence, you would go with Philo and say, yeah, it's highly inconclusive, but it seems pretty improbable that there's this great eternal guy in the sky, right? That we tend to get posited by traditional religions. And so on the one hand, Cleanthes is understanding all that and taking it in. On the other hand, he's insistent on effectively using everything that he can cite in the world as a sort of prop for this game of imagining, where you imagine all the things to be true, right? And another difference between religious credence and factual belief that I gestured at earlier was the difference between voluntariness and involuntariness. So let me pause for a second to explain that, and then I'll bring it back and connect it to what's going on with Cleanthes in this dialogue. So a lot of your factual, well, not a lot of your factual beliefs, just basically definitionally, at least as I set things up, factual beliefs are involuntary, right? So you factually believe that California is on the west coast of the United States, right?
Mm.
And it's not like you wanted to believe that. That's just how things are for you, right? So when you factually believe something, you can't help believing it, right? And that's the kind of flip side of the evidence. If you have an attitude that's dictated by evidence, right, then that's just how things are for you. It seems like even if you happen to be wrong about this or that factual belief, which of course happens, if you happen to be wrong, as long as you factually believe something, it just seems like knowledge to you. That's one of Dan Sperber's ways of putting things. And if something seems like knowledge to you, you don't have the voluntary control to say, well, look, Preet, if I gave you $1 million, would you just choose to stop believing that California is on the
Mm.
West Coast? You'd be like, well, I'd like the million, but I can't talk myself out of it, right? I
Right.
just happen to know that that's where it is. And so factual beliefs are involuntary. If you factually believe something, you can't help believing it. Whereas there's lots of reason to think that religious credence is voluntary. So people talk
Mm.
about choosing to believe and choosing Jesus. And in Tanya Lerman's works, she reports informants from the Vineyard Church. That's a large American evangelical church, which also has churches around the world. Tanya Lerman's written this book, When God Talks Back, really fantastic book. But people often talk about choosing to believe, right? Choosing to believe that they heard the voice of God. So if you can choose to have a religious belief, and you can't choose whether or not you factually believe something, again, those are different ways of relating to ideas, right? So we're starting to get a cluster of kind of different psychological features. On the one hand, factual belief dictated by evidence and involuntary. On the other hand, you've got religious credence, which is not dictated by evidence, right? Just in terms of psychological causes. And it's very much a matter of choice, right? It responds to incentives. People, for example, they convert to a religion and adopt all these beliefs because they want to marry someone,
Mm.
right? That's voluntariness. So there's various qualifiers. People say it's not voluntary because there's outside pressure. Well, actually giving into outside pressure is ultimately a choice.
Mm.
And that's a different psychological process from being just having a mental state controlled by evidence. All right, so go back to Cleanthes in the final dialogue of Hume's dialogues on natural religion, where he says, yes, and we should cause that first principle, we should call that first principle or whatever caused the universe to come to be, we should call that God. Notice he's making it a choice, right? He's effectively recognizing that there's voluntary latitude in terms of how we're going to think about the first cause or whatever originated the universe. And because he has voluntary latitude, he's going to glom it on to a particular term, which is associated with traditional religion. So there's kind of an illustration of the voluntariness of religious credence right there in that last dialogue in Cleanthes' own thinking.
Yeah, that so I mean, if just going kind of comparing Hume's book and then also the way you've designed your book, to say that we can we do voluntarily we're volunteering to believe in God, or we're volunteering to believe in a specific kind of higher power, that doesn't really take away that that doesn't seem to, that awareness doesn't seem to dilute the impact of it though, right? Like it's still something that's to know that I'm choosing to believe in a God is still good enough as someone that believes in God.
Yeah, well, I think the key point to make, let me actually back up a little bit and give the reader some background on what I'm actually arguing in Religion as Make-Believe. Again, that's the title of my book, and then also I've argued this for years leading up to this in various articles. So I'm basically saying there's what I call a two-map cognitive structure, right? There's your factual beliefs that generally tend to represent mundane features of the world, like where your house is, what kind of car you have, where you were born, how tall you are, and so on. Now and then there's your religious credences, right? And those are typically representing the supernatural agents and events that are depicted in the doctrines and stories of your religion. Now, the key point, though, is that they're not psychologically processed in the same way. All right. You're not relating to the ideas in the one case in the same way as you're relating to ideas in the other case. All right. So, what are the differences? Well, I'll just kind of list it. We've already listed a couple. The factual beliefs, those are highly responsive to evidence, right? If you look in the fridge and you thought there were tomatoes there, and then you have visual evidence that they're not, then poof, it goes away. All right. And then they're involuntary, and then they're also uncompartmentalized. And let me explain what I mean by that. Your factual beliefs about how the world is comprise a model of what reality is like that you're effectively using all the time. Whenever you act in the world, you're relying on your factual belief model of the world that's encoded in your brain. Even when you're playing make-believe, right? You're pretending there's an alternate world. Your factual beliefs about, where the tree is, where the ditch is, that you're actually holding a plastic sword instead of a real sword. All of those are continuing to guide your action in the world, even when you have another layer of make-believe play, right? Which is processed in a different way. Okay, and then the religious credences, by way of contrast, they're voluntary, they're not sensitive to evidence, and they do, in point of psychological fact, tend to be quite compartmentalized, right? So one thing that we can say is that religious people in various traditions, they spend a lot of their day just acting like God doesn't even exist. But then when they go to church, or they go to mosque, or they go to synagogue, or they go to whatever temple of whatever religion they practice, or they're engaging in sacrifices to the ancestors, in those particular sacred contexts, they tend to symbolically represent the things that they religiously creed. Okay, so instead of guiding action across the board, like factual beliefs, religious credences tend to be compartmentalized in terms of when and where and in what contexts they guide action at all. It's like there's this off switch to them. Okay, so the point being that you've got this two-map cognitive structure. The religious credences, in a lot of ways, they resemble imagining in that they are compartmentalized and in that they aren't sensitive to evidence, right? You can imagine what you like. It's not having to change due to evidence, and it's voluntary. So that's not to say that religious credences are unimportant or don't make a
Hmm.
difference in people's lives, but it is to say that it's a different way of relating to ideas, and how religious credences are going to ultimately guide people's behavior is a different sort of process from how factual beliefs guide your behavior,
Mm.
right? And so people often object to my work saying, well, there can't be a difference because people act on their factual beliefs and they act on their religious beliefs. But the form of action is very different, and the compartmentalization of the action is strikingly different, right? So that's how I would go about defending the distinction. But to acknowledge your point, look, religious credences play roles in people's lives that are very important to them, right? In part, what makes them what they are is that they do constitute your group identity, right? It constitutes, to a large extent, where you feel you belong in terms of the social world. And then it also is a basis for marking what's sacred to you, right? So valuing things in a sacralizing way is a very different way of valuing things in like a utilitarian way, right? Utilitarian way of valuing things is like, well, how many Netflix subscriptions is this bicycle actually worth, right? You can kind of trade off, right? Am I really willing to to buy a bicycle that, is worth 10 years of Netflix subscriptions? Nah, maybe that's, it's taking away too much. But things that you value in a sacred way, that's not regarded as something that you can trade off. It's sort of inviolable. So the role of religious credences is to mark actions, agents, and events as belonging to that which you can value in a sacred way. So it's gonna play a huge role in determining how you act and who you interact with.
Yeah, I want to touch upon so many of the things you said. Well, one is, how religious beliefs work in a group versus how factual beliefs work in a group. So, I think you have a whole chapter dedicated to that, and I think you have, the way you distinguish between the two is mundane beliefs and then groupish beliefs.
Yeah.
And yeah, if you can talk to that, I think that'd be great.
Yeah. So one of the interesting things is if you think about your factual beliefs, right? They're not a basis for identifying with an in-group, right? So you and I factually believe that, water is made of H2O, that wood comes from trees, that water flows in streams, that clouds, excuse me, clouds produce rain, and so on. And we're not part of some special in-group that adopts these beliefs, right? And the point being that since factually believing is a sort of rationally responsive to evidence kind of attitude, the things that you factually believe aren't going to be all that distinctive. They're going to be stuff that anyone, given suitable evidence, is going to go ahead and believe, right? But what about the idea that a baby was born from a virgin?
Mm,
Right? Or what about the idea that there's a God with the body of a boy and the head of an elephant,
mhm,
right? These are not things that any rational person will believe. They're highly distinctive. And what part of what makes them distinctive is that they don't sit so well with the evidence of what we know about the world. And this is kind of one of my key ideas. It's the very peculiarness and unresponsiveness to evidence that enables religious credences to play their group identity constituting roles. Because if you quote unquote believe contrary to the evidence, all of a sudden you're going to be believing contents that are very different from what any old person would
Mm,
believe. All right. We couldn't start a religion around the proposition that water falls from clouds, right? Because everyone thinks that, right? We
yeah,
wouldn't, we wouldn't. But what about, okay, well, there's a deity who weeps
yeah,
uh, on certain days, right? And the deity weeping is what causes the rain to fall. Now it's weird enough that we're going to
yeah,
be, by believing that, different and distinctive, right? And then we might create certain rituals where we like induce tears in ourselves to placate the god, right? And so on. So groupish beliefs are going to be those, just definitionally in terms of how I set things up, but that's going to be the class of beliefs that explain in part what people's group identities are, right? So and then the kind of connection that I draw is that in order for them to play the role that they play, they're going to have the psychological processing features of religious credences, like not being responsive to evidence. So the key point, and I'm not sure I'm making myself totally clear now, but the bug is, or what looks like a bug from a rational standpoint, is actually a feature.
yeah,
Okay. So a lot of people look at the religions of other people and they say, how can they believe that crazy stuff?
yeah,
Whereby crazy, they mean something like completely not coherent with the
right,
evidence that normal, rational, intelligent people know. How can they believe that crazy stuff? Like the crazy is a bug.
yeah,
But if the social role of the beliefs is to be kind of a distinctive marker of one's in-group, the bug, the craziness, is actually a feature. Because the whole point is to seem crazy to you, to seem crazy to people outside the in-group, right? Because that's what defines the boundary of the in-group. So that's kind of that's kind of a rough and ready approximation of my distinction between mundane and groupish beliefs.
yeah. I mean, I don't know if you touch upon this in your book, but I'm wondering if, like, do you need to then say that I believe this? Like, what is the utility out of saying I believe in this as opposed to just being like, this is the game I like to play. Like, I like to play with Barbies, or I like to play with a boy that, has an elephant's head, an elephant's face for a head or something like that. Like, this is the game I like to play on Saturdays, and but he may or may not exist. Like, I guess I'm what I get hung up on is the attachment to the fact
Mhm.
that something like this exists. Um,
Yeah. So I think you're entirely right. And this kind of gestures at one of the criticisms I've gotten, where I say, okay, look, religious credence is effectively a form of compartmentalized imagining. Well, how is it different from make-believe play? All right. It seems like it's like way more serious. And I think that's partly what you're getting at when you ask this question. Well, what is it? What is this I believe stuff,
yeah,
right? It seems to be saying something much more than hey, I'm playing pretend that there is this deity, right? Or that there are these ancestors, or that there are these spirits roaming around the forest. Okay. So I mean, a couple of things are worth pointing out. The believe language and the believe talk is not as emphasized in some religious traditions as others, right? But just to go into it, when you play make believe, right? We can play, for example, make believe like we're dinosaurs. Okay, so when my cousin's kids, I'm playing with them. I might pretend to be a dinosaur, and there's that two-map cognitive structure, right? I have factual beliefs about what my physical shape is and so on, and that we're in a living room, and that that's a boy and not a dinosaur, and that I'm a man and not a dinosaur. Okay, but then I have this imaginative layer. Well, if that's the same sort of thing with religion, what's the difference? And the long and short of it is that if you have a game that marks certain things as sacred, right? Like certain
Mm,
patches of ground as the sacred patches of ground, then your religious credences, unlike your imaginings, are going to be the basis for a lot of strong emotional reactions, right? So if someone, if I have a stick that I'm pretending is a magic sword when I'm
yeah.
playing make believe, okay, say I end the game and then someone, spits on the stick or pokes a piece of dog poop with the stick or whatever, I'm not going to be all upset about it, right? But once that, and there's a lot of tension around sacred props, but once something has been designated as, a sacred patch of ground, I mean, we're seeing all this fighting in Israel and Palestine. A lot of it is about different patches of earth that have been effectively imagined in certain ways. So the activation of sacred values and the categorization of entities and events and objects in the world as having this inviolable sacred status, that's something that religious credences do that your ordinary make-believe imaginings don't really do. And that makes a big difference to downstream behavior. So, and I think that's kind of captured in the language of I believe, right?
Right.
So believe is there's a great book by Wilfred Cantwell Smith called Believing and Historical Perspective. And he relates the word believe to, to hold dear or to love, right? So it's supposed to be originally cognate with various Germanic roots, meaning to love. So Cantwell Smith says that in the time of the King James Bible, to believe meant something like to hold dear,
Yeah.
right? So what you're really doing is when you play make believe, and maybe you play make believe in a not so serious way, but with religious contents, right? Like Jesus Christ Superstar or Godspell, right? Those are Broadway plays. They're plays. Um, so you can do that, but when it really becomes a matter of religious credence is when you start also having sacred valuing of different things, right? And I actually think there's a spectrum there, right? Where your group might be constituted by people who uh, play Shakespeare scenes on the weekend, right? But that could become, you could kind of imagine that morphing into a religion under certain conditions, right? And that's what I try to show in the prologue of my book, that there's actually a continuum between ordinary play
Yeah.
and religious ritual and symbolic action.
Yeah, I think if I am just choosing to play by myself, then I can decide the rules to some extent. Whereas if I'm doing it in a group, then there are kind of agreed upon rules to the game. And those
Mm-hmm.
rules cannot change and they're there for a reason. And yeah, I think there's a lot to it. Another thing I think that you mentioned, about factual beliefs is, the example that you gave around Netflix subscriptions and how you could
Right.
use that as currency for a bike. And I feel like religion also kind of has that in a different way though, where it's like, okay, I'll do this kind act, like I'll go donate some money and that should, I'm going to get something in return for it. So, there is a logic to it. And I think that, which is similar to the factual belief side of things. I mean, but there isn't evidence for it, so I guess that's the difference. But there is an internal logic to religious beliefs that I think, um, yeah, that only work within that space.
Yeah, I think there's a handful of things that we could go into here. But I tend to think of the religious credence logic. It tends to be more symbolic.
Right.
And what you get with a lot of religious behavior, and this is, I think, what has confused theorists for a long time, is action that is apparently instrumental. All right, where you sort of say, okay, in performing this ritual or saying this kind of prayer, it's what will effectively cause, God to heal this illness, or the rain to fall if it's a rain dance, or if we sacrifice this animal, it's gonna feed the ancestors who will then not be mad at us and will have better fortune because they're going to be favoring us more, and so on and so forth. And so it's easy to look at that and say, yeah, this is just like with factual belief. They factually believe that if they feed the ancestors will be happy, and then uh, inflict less misfortune. But most of the time, when people perform these apparently instrumental actions like rain dances, they also do the mundane, ordinary, humdrum, empirical based actions that actually take care of things, right? So it's the religious actions are almost always supplemental to more normal actions that a complete atheist would also do, right? Like irrigating the ditches, um, like going to the doctor, and so on and so forth. So what you have to ask yourself is, and I think also, giving money in order to store up treasure in heaven, it seems like it's an instrumental action, right? Like, oh, I want to be rich in the afterlife, so I'll give money here. But it's really more of a way of uh, signaling to the group that
Mhm.
you're part of them, right? That you're doing what they do, that you're making costly sacrifices to show that you're on board and you're not just going to defect. So the apparent, the apparently instrumental actions, kind of the logic of it is that they're opportunities to symbolically represent different ways in which you show your allegiance to the group.
Yeah, I don't know. Sometimes it's allegiance to the group, but it's also to show me that I'm a part of the group. Might also
Hmm.
be it, or it. Yeah, I think with Hinduism, there is, it's not as kind of it's not like you go to church every day, every specific day of the week or anything like that. So
Right, right.
so I think yeah, it might also be on a continuum where it's like, okay, I am in a group, but I'm also um, I think some religions might be more towards that group end of the spectrum, whereas other religions might be more individualistic in that sense.
Yeah. No, that's certainly true. I mean, there's going to be a
Yeah.
lot of variation.
Yeah.
What kind of you mentioned giving money. What other kind of actions are you thinking about?
Um, well, I was thinking, maybe in Christianity this could be something like, oh, I'll if something like a lying is a sin, but it's a smaller, because there's like I've heard that there's a hierarchy of sins, right, in Christianity. So I was like, okay,
It
maybe lying is not so bad, so I'll only like get punished this much because of that, or I'll make up for it in this specific way.
it
Uh,
really depends upon which branch of Christianity
yes.
that you're in. I mean, under Catholicism, there is a sort of measure, right? For, well, how many Hail
Yeah.
Marys do you have to say for this thing, right? And
Yeah.
it's not the same sin to sin. In a more Calvinist vein, right? It's more the perspective that, A, there's original sin, meaning
Right.
just by being born, you inherit the sins of Adam. And there's a famous Bible verse, I'm not remembering the book and chapter and verse, but basically saying any sin is so awful in the eyes of God's perfection that it's worthy of damnation, right? So
Yeah.
so stealing a pack of gum, serial killing, right? It's all so awful to God that
Right.
you're gonna have to need God's grace. So it does but on the bright side, Jesus will forgive you, right? So
Right.
the narratives do play out differently in different Christian sects.
Yeah. Cool. Well, it was so great chatting. I feel like I could keep picking your brain for another hour and I would just keep learning more and more. But yeah, if you want to plug in your book one more time,
Yeah.
Religion as Make-Believe.
So let me plug it for your audience.
Yes.
Religion as make-believe, a theory of belief, imagination, and group identity. And I will say to your audience, it's only in hardcover so far. I'm hoping it'll come out in paperback. So it's a little bit pricey. It's at $45 because it's an academic book in hardcover. If you don't want to pay that, I would recommending it to your local library. It's a great way to interact with a public library. And oftentimes librarians will take suggestions, and there'll even be a form on the website. So if you want to order it through the library, I think that's a great idea. And also Hume's Dialogues on Natural Religion, wherever you live, that might not be in the public library yet either. So
True.
go ahead and if you do me the honor, put in a request for my book right alongside Hume's, and I'd be in wonderful company and very appreciative as well.
Yeah. And I have it on Kindle, so if you want to buy it on Kindle, that's also available.
All right. Well, thanks for having me, Preet.
Oh,
It's been a pleasure.
thank you so much. Okay, I'm gonna